Good morning, everybody, and welcome to our webinar on the new subcontracting requirements, pitfalls and possibilities, led by Bryony Kingsland. Thanks for joining us. Before Bryony starts, I'd like to explain a few things about our webinar platform to let you get the most out of the experience. You will all be in listen-only mode, so to engage with the webinar, please use the on-screen panel. Using the tabs on that panel, you can adjust your audio settings. If all else fails with audio, do please try logging out and logging back into the webinar on your computer. You can also use the question and chat tabs to engage with us. We expect that our webinar will be popular, but our team will do its best to answer your questions and queries. During the webinar, we will be running 3 polls. To record your response, please click on the on-screen voting button when asked to do so. After the webinar, we will provide a recording, a copy of the slides and a fact sheet to address any unanswered questions, and they will go on our website. Now I'd like to hand over to Bryony.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the subcontracting workshop, or subcontracting webinar, I should say. Today I'm going to do a very quick overview of the levy and funding, and then I'm going to cover the actual public procurement, or a little bit about public procurement, and then I'm going to speak very in some detail about the new subcontracting due diligence requirements and rules, because under the new apprenticeship arrangements there are some extensive changes to the subcontracting rules for providers who are considering subcontracting, and also subcontractors if you are considering working with a provider to subcontract provision. So without further ado, I'm going to move on, but first of all, Katie's just going to ask you one of our first poll questions.
So the first question is, which of the following categories describes you? Is it a provider, an employer provider, an employer, or planning to be one of the above? So just the last couple of seconds. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. So I know we've mainly got providers online, but we've also got a few employer providers as well. This webinar will give guidance to both those sets of attendees. So if you're an employer, or if you're an employer provider, or even if you're a provider, this hopefully will help you going forward to understand what's going to be needed post 1st of May when the new arrangements come into place. So let's just do a very quick overview of the levy funding and policy. So as we know, the government is committed to significantly increasing the quality and quantity of apprenticeships in England, because we have a target to reach 3 million starts by 2020. We're currently at the moment apparently on target to hit that, so it'll be interesting to see what the new arrangements, what influence the new arrangements have on our current position. But to enable this to occur, the government is basically introducing the levy because they need to cover the cost of apprenticeships, and we need to make sure we hit that 2020 target. The levy came in a few days ago on the 1st, well, actually I think it's today, 6th of April today, so today is the levy day. And it will contribute to improving the workforce skills in the economy into the 2020s, which is going to be increasingly important because with Brexit, we know we're likely to lose some of the current skills that we have from our workforce. We certainly won't be getting the flow of skills into the workforce that we have had whilst we've been part of the European Union. So improving our own workforce skills and the workforce skills of our younger generation and current other generations is going to become increasingly important. Use of the levy and how providers and employer providers spend it, and employers spend it, will be carefully monitored by the Skills Funding Agency. And in fact, at the recent FE Week Apprenticeship Conference, it was flagged by Keith Smith, who's the head of policy and programs and funding at the Skills Funding Agency. I should say the Education and Skills Funding Agency now, shouldn't I? I'll just call them the ESFA, I think that's easiest. So who's head of programs and funding at the ESFA, indicated that they are looking to release some more compliance and risk documents in the very near future, because they are becoming aware that there are arrangements in place between some employers and providers that don't meet the funding rules, and they want to be very clear about what everybody has to do to adhere to those rules. So expect some further compliance documents in the near future. So the policy intent is that the levy should only be spent on apprenticeships and their delivery. So that's the actual on-programme and the assessment of apprenticeships. And recent communications from the SFA, as I said earlier, indicate that the funding rules will be strengthened. Well, the new iteration of the funding rules has come out. We've had version 2, and there are improvements and other rules inside those funding rules which will need to be adhered to, which I've included later on in this presentation. So the funding rules have been strengthened to make sure that there's appropriate use of the levy, and the ESFA has said that there may be sanctions imposed on both providers and employers if they don't adhere to the new funding rules, and also to the employer legal agreement that the Skills Funding Agency will send to employers once they've established an apprenticeship programme with a provider. So that's the levy, funding and policy. Now the next section is public procurement. I'm only going to touch very quickly on this because public procurement, the subcontracting rules for public procurement, is not a specialty of mine, I think I'm happy to say. But if you are a prime or main provider or an employer providers, you must decide if you subcontract whether you need to take your own legal advice before subcontracting, because the public contract regulations for 2015 may require you to adhere to some rules and regulations in relation to your subcontracting. So this screen that you're seeing at the moment, that's the .gov webpage that you can go to, and the link is there in pink below the main body of type. This is the public procurement page on .gov.uk, which gives you advice and guidance and takes you to various other documents about whether you would need to adhere to public procurement policy. So do make sure, if you are spending your levy funds and you're considering subcontracting large amounts of money, that you are not affected by these particular regulations. There are some principles of public procurement that you probably need to be aware of. Oh, sorry, we're popping back and forwards there a little bit. Sorry about that, everybody. So the overriding principles of public procurement are that all public procurement, I'm struggling to get out of it, it's a bit of a tongue twister, must be based on value for money and achieved through open and fair competition, with all operators treated equally and without discrimination. What they're basically asking for here is open and competitive tendering, that any organisation can apply to deliver whatever it is you want subcontracted, and that they're all treated fairly, and that your scoring mechanism and your assessment of your tender responses are all scored in an open and fair way. But also that as a procuring contracting authority, which would be yourselves if you are considering subcontracting and you know that public procurement regulations apply to you, that you act in a transparent and proportionate manner. Now that means that all of your procurement activities should be open for audit if needed, and that you've got the evidence that you've treated everybody equally and fairly and without discrimination. And finally, there are financial thresholds at which the public procurement policy and regulations applies, and they are in the documents that I've listed on the previous slide and also in this link here. And it tells you at what point how much money you may be looking to subcontract, whether you have to go out to tender for that or whether you can just make your own choice of subcontractor. So those are the principles of public procurement and subcontracting. Katie is now going to ask another poll question before I go into the main part of our webinar.
So the second poll is, are you going to subcontract some apprenticeship programs, considering subcontracting but not fully sure, don't know enough to make a decision yet and are here to find out whether we should consider it, know nothing about subcontracting, what is it all about?
Good, so we've got a high proportion of people who are looking to subcontract, that's 39%, and then 22% of you are considering it but aren't 100% sure, and 31% want to know more before you make the final decision, and 7% of you know nothing and want to find out a lot more. Well, hopefully this webinar will help all of you with what you're planning to do going forward. So basically what I'm going to cover in this webinar is all the subcontracting rules and regulations that the Skills Funding Agency, the Education and Skills Funding Agency, the ESFA, has put in place in preparation for May 1st. These are the two main documents, and there are a few other bits and pieces of documents, but these are the two main documents that whether you're a training provider or an employer provider, that you should, if you're considering subcontracting, have either read online or printed out a copy and are keeping it as your Bible from this point forward. And the link there on the right-hand side in the pink writing will take you straight to those two documents on the page where you'll find them. So who can subcontract? First of all, both main and employer providers can subcontract, and you can subcontract to the following organisations. So first of all, as a main or employer provider, you could subcontract some of your provision to a small provider. A small provider that has less than 100k per year of cumulative contracts. Now, when I say cumulative contracts, that means contracts across all of the providers they may be working with. So if you have a small provider that you're working with, and they are also working with other main providers or other employer providers, you would need to check that their subcontracting cumulative amounts for all of the subcontracts across all the providers they work with does not exceed 100k per year. If it does, then they need to be on the Apprenticeship Register of Training Providers. If they're not, then the Skills Funding Agency could impose sanctions. So as a main employer provider, you can also subcontract to specialist supporting providers who are on the register as a specialist or supporting provider, up to a threshold of 500k per year. Again, that is a cumulative threshold. So if your supporting or specialist provider has a variety of different contracts with a variety of different main or employer providers, and they again exceed that threshold of 500k, they either need to apply, well, they can't exceed the threshold. If they are getting close to exceeding the threshold, they need to apply to become a main provider, or you need to stop giving them subcontracts and take them over that threshold. As a main provider and employer provider, you can also subcontract to other main providers.
Right, it was just.
You can also subcontract to other main providers if they are on ROTAP. And finally, you can also subcontract to a connected company, and within your organisation. And those connected companies are those that are defined by HMRC, who are also on the register of apprenticeship training providers, unless, of course, they are subcontracting less than 100k. So those are the organisations you subcontract to. What you need to remember if you're an employer provider, however, is that you can only subcontract your provision to be delivered to employees inside your organisation. So if you're an employer provider and you want to subcontract, your subcontractor can only deliver your levy funding to your employees. So whether it's a main provider, a specialist provider, a small or another of your connected companies, they can only deliver to your employees or your connected company employees. So before you even start subcontracting, there are quite a few things you need to think about. So these are the due diligence checks that you would need to carry out as a main or employer provider before you consider subcontracting. And the Skills Funding Agency do check these results. They will inspect them if they've got any concerns at all. So you need to keep everything that you actually collect as part of your due diligence work as evidence in case the Skills Funding Agency decides they want to see it. So you need to look at the financial checks. Check the audited accounts of your subcontractor if possible, i.e. if they have audited accounts. Check the staff and company directors that work for that organisation. Are there any conflicts of interest? Are there any background checks you could do on those staff and company directors that would lead you to believe there might be risks for you as a main or employer provider? You should also look at the staff that are going to be delivering via your subcontractors. Do they have the appropriate qualifications? Do they have the appropriate experience to deliver the apprenticeships that you want delivering inside your organisation to your employees? If your subcontractor has previously been Ofsteded, you should look at their Ofsted reports. You need to make sure that they don't have any grade 4s for apprenticeship delivery, and if they've got an overarching grade 4, that would definitely be a concern that you would need to take into consideration before giving them subcontract. if there's any performance data available to you on those particular providers, and if you use the Find an Apprenticeship Provider tool that the ESFA provides online, which enables you to search for providers in your area that deliver apprenticeships, you can look on that tool for potential subcontractors as well. Many of the providers on that tool have performance data included in their information online, so you can check there, or you can go onto the Ofsted site and check the Ofsted reports on the Ofsted site. And you may be able to get other performance data from EpiChoices, which is another site that the Skills Funding Agency uses to collect data on providers. You need to check that your subcontractors have equality and diversity policies in place which are appropriate and up to date, and also that your subcontractor is taking account of the prevent duty and has some sort of policy in place to implement the prevent duty. Now, the prevent duty is a sort of safeguarding approach which applies to all providers, which is their responsibility to prevent radicalisation of any of their employees or apprentices. So, providers, if you're a provider, you must not agree the use of delivery subcontractors with an employer if they do not have the knowledge, skills and experience of contracting with and managing delivery of subcontractors. This is a strange one realistically, because if you're a provider and you never subcontracted before, and the Skills Funding Agency is saying in their rules that you don't have the knowledge, skills and experience of contracting with and managing delivery of subcontractors, how on earth are you expected to get that experience? You've never done it before. Skills Funding Agency say you must not subcontract unless you've done it before and you've got experience of it. So how do you get it? I think there are a couple of ways that you can do this. You could work with another provider in your area if they're willing to act as a mentor, or you could potentially see if there are other mentors or consultants in the area that you could contract with that could help you set up your subcontracting arrangements and enable you to have the knowledge, skills and experience to be able to subcontract effectively and effectively use the levy, and also manage all your due diligence and quality checks that you're going to need to do. So there are ways of establishing knowledge and experience that doesn't mean you have to previously subcontracted before that you may want to think about. So, other due diligence that you need to be aware of. Again, I'm just going to reiterate those thresholds because they are really, really important. Cumulative subcontractors who are not on ROTAC cannot go above that 100k threshold across all of their subcontracts with all providers. Supporting providers, it's the 500k cumulative threshold for subcontractors. They've got to be on the register. If they are on the register and they're nearing that threshold, they need to apply at the next opening to become a main provider. They can obviously still subcontract with you at that point, but they do need to be as a main provider rather than as a supporting provider. Now, the Skills Funding Agency will place restrictions on your future use of subcontractors if you exceed these thresholds, and they may also permanently exclude any organisation for delivering apprenticeship training as a subcontractor if that organisation allows their funding to exceed the total of those thresholds in any 1 year. So if you're a main provider and employer provider and you are subcontracting yourselves, and you're within, and you've gone on as a supporting or small provider, you need to watch your own threshold because you could be permanently excluded from delivery. So, main and employer providers who run subcontracts need to complete a delivery subcontractor declaration form. The Skills Funding Agency publishes these generally about twice a year, sometimes around sort of May time and 31st of March, and then also sometimes around October, November. And they send out that form online, generally via their either via a direct email to their contact inside the provider. They also flag it on their ESFA update, which if you're not signed up to the Skills Funding Agency update, which is a weekly bulletin they send out, do go on .gov, put in SFA update, it will come up and you should sign up for those bulletins. They're very useful, informative, and tell you everything that you need to know the Skills Funding Agency needs you to adhere to. So you'll need to complete that delivery subcontractor declaration form once or twice a year. If you don't, the Skills Funding Agency suspend payments, and also if you don't subcontract, you must still provide a nil return. It's no good ignoring the form, you've got to complete it whether you're subcontracting or not. And until you do complete it and send it back to the Skills Funding Agency or the Education and Skills Funding Agency, they may well suspend your payments. Not what anybody needs. And also, if you're an employer provider, one of the issues about subcontracting is that the Skills Funding Agency or the Education and Skills Funding Agency, the ESFA, is an organisation that is responsible for probity of public money and spend of that public money. So they will expect you to evidence the actual costs of delivery of apprenticeship training and on-programme assessment. Now, what that really means is that you will have to evidence how you are spending your levy money and prove to the Skills Funding Agency that you are spending it on delivery of apprenticeships. So that could mean providing information such as your staff salaries, how many hours those staff are spending on delivery of apprenticeships. You could look at a timesheeting approach to that. What else you might be spending the levy on, such as on-programme materials. You'll need to keep invoices and receipts of invoices, bank transfers. All of that evidence needs to be kept to prove that you are spending the levy on apprenticeship training and delivery and on-programme assessment only. So there are also subcontracting rules. So moving on from the due diligence, main providers can use subcontractors only if requested and agreed with the employer at the start of each apprenticeship. Now, if you're the lead prime provider, it's you who must maintain the relationship with each employer at all times. And you must not allow your delivery subcontractors to lead that relationship with the employer. Now, as many of you may know, if you already work as main providers and you have subcontracts, that's an unusual position. In a lot of cases, it's certainly a new element of the funding rules. At the moment, we quite often have main providers who subcontract full delivery to a subcontracting organisation that has the main relationship with the employer. And the main provider gives them the money to deliver, in a lot of cases, top slices at a management fee for return of ILR data and some of the quality procedures and processes they need to take forward, but they have very little or no contact whatsoever with that employer. Going forward from 1st of May, you will no longer be able to do this. So this is an interesting change that is going to probably tax you and your subcontractors. And one of the most important aspects of this is how strong your partnership arrangements are between you, the main provider, and your subcontractors. If your subcontractor until now has held the main lead relationship with that employer, they are inevitably going to be very nervous about relinquishing that main relationship with their employer, because they could lose that relationship if you, the main provider, then establish that relationship. So open and fair and transparent partnership arrangements between you and your delivery subcontractors are going to be increasingly important. And what you put inside your legal agreements and your contracts with your subcontractor, again, are going to be increasingly important, because in the final analysis, those contracts could end up with you and your subcontractors in a court of law, because that's the approach and the route for resolving these issues. So do make sure when you're establishing those new prime provider subcontractor relationships and legal agreements that you cover that aspect of it that keeps both you and your subcontracting organisation safe, and the employer safe as well. So funding for all elements of each apprenticeship that you deliver is routed either through you, the single main provider, or through the employer provider. And through the single main provider if you're an employer if you're working with employers and they've chosen you. And this includes also for English and maths funding, which doesn't come out of the levy. So prime providers and employers providers obviously must carry out those due diligence checks. Subcontractors can deliver full or part apprenticeships. They don't just have to deliver a bit of an apprenticeship, unless of course they're coming in, they're delivering a specialist aspect of an apprenticeship for you, for example, the clinical aspect of a health and social care apprenticeship, for example. You must have that legally binding contract with each subcontractor that I mentioned earlier on, and all of your delivery subcontractors must be contracted directly by you, whether you're a main provider or whether you're an employer. They've got to be contracted directly by you. You must not allow second-level subcontracting. And for anybody who doesn't know what second-level subcontracting is, if you are a main provider and you subcontract provision to a subcontracting organisation, you cannot allow them to further subcontract that delivery elsewhere. So you cannot subcontract that delivery, allow your subcontractor to subcontract to someone else. That's second-level subcontracting. And at the recent AAC conference, an interesting query came up from one provider who asked, well, what about end assessment organisations? Because obviously the main provider has the relationship and the subcontract with the end assessment organisation who comes in and end assesses all apprenticeship standards. It's more than likely that end assessment organisations will also use associates who are in themselves subcontractors. And could that be perceived and viewed by the Skills Funding Agency as second-level subcontracting? And the Skills Funding Agency has looked at this and said that no, it doesn't, because in the case of EPA, endpoint assessment, they're very aware that in most cases, endpoint assessment organisations will not fully employ associate assessors on a full-time basis, because it's just not feasible. They don't know when they're going to carry out end assessments, so they will have large pools, probably, of associates who will be subcontracted in their own right. But the skills funding agency said that doesn't apply with EPA. So, further subcontracting rules. As a main provider or an employer provider, you must deliver directly some of the apprenticeship training or on-program assessment associated with the apprenticeship program you are delivering inside that employer. Now, what that means is, as far as the skills funding agency is concerned, is that you cannot just deliver a token amount to satisfy that rule. You can't deliver one apprenticeship in amongst 100 apprenticeships that's being delivered inside an employer. And you can't just deliver English and maths as part of an apprenticeship if you are delivering apprenticeships inside an employer. So you have to ensure that what you deliver is not limited to a brief input at the start of each apprenticeship. So you can't just do the assessment, for example, or the induction, which is not paid for by the levy anyway. And you can't, as I said before, deliver to just a few of a large number of apprentices. Now, I've asked the skills funding agency exactly what they mean by a substantial amount, because in the previous iteration of the funding rules, they did say 50%. They've now removed that 50% as a substantial amount, or they said 50% or more, but they won't really give a figure about what a substantial amount is. But I think you're going to have to use your brains on this one. If you're delivering 100 apprenticeships inside an employer and you're only delivering 5, I don't think the skills funding agency would consider that to be a substantial amount. But if you were delivering a range of apprenticeships, for example, you were delivering health, say business admin, you were delivering IT, you were delivering engineering, and your specialist subcontractor delivered all the engineering, and you delivered the business and IT aspect, or the business aspect, and there was a third subcontractor delivering IT because those were your specialisms, I don't think the skills funding agency would have an issue with that. So where the employer is the delivery subcontractor, as I said earlier, they must report the actual cost of delivery. So if as a main provider you are working with an employer and they are giving their levy to you to deliver apprenticeships, but they are also acting as a subcontractor to you for delivery of some of those apprenticeships, they can do that, they can act as a subcontractor to you for their levy and get some of that levy funding back for you. But they have to evidence the spend of that money and what they're using it for. So, for example, we work with a health and social care organisation, and as an employer, they deliver the clinical aspect of the health and social care level 3 that they deliver. And that's a very specialist area inside that apprenticeship. And the provider delivers the rest of the apprenticeship. But they will be able to claim back the funding from their levy for the delivery of that clinical aspect of the health and social care apprenticeship standard. But they have to evidence all and everything that they are doing with that money so they can prove to the skills funding agency that it is being spent on an apprenticeship. So you will also need to obtain an annual report from an external auditor if the apprenticeship contracts with your delivery subcontractors exceed 100k in any 1 year. That's a requirement of your evidence for the skills funding agency. And you need to have robust measures in place to ensure that you do not inadvertently fund extremist organisations through subcontracting an apprenticeship or on-programme assessment process. So that's another thing to be aware of that comes in with your prevent duty. And finally, as I said before, no second-level subcontracting. So what are the subcontracting essentials? The most important things you need to be aware of as organisations, whether it's an employer, provider, or whether it's as a main provider, is to adhere to the funding rules. And those documents that I flagged earlier on in the presentation are really going to be your Bible for what you can and can't do. The other thing that you must do is collect accurate ILR data and audit evidence to evidence all the spend of your money. Now, the ILR data is what's sent up to the Skills Funding Agency monthly. If you're subcontracting for the first time, you need to collect the appropriate data from your subcontracting organisations to enable you to complete the ILR return for all of those apprenticeships to the Skills Funding Agency, including the ones that your subcontractor is delivering. Or including the small aspect of the apprenticeship that your subcontractor might be delivering. You also need to carry out regular quality checks on your subcontractors. And finally, ensure no second-level subcontracting and that you carry out your pre-contract due diligence to make sure that whoever you're subcontracting with is a safe subcontractor for you. So let's have a look at some of those quality assurance requirements within subcontracts. First of all, excuse me, I'm just going to take a sip of water. I'm getting a bit of a dry throat. Okay, so first of all, your contract and written agreements. as the main provider, the prime provider, or the employer provider, you are responsible for resolving all the disputes and disagreements between the employer and the delivery subcontractors. So you can't leave it to your delivery subcontractor to resolve these disputes once you become aware of them. You must go in and act as an intermediary and ensure that those disagreements or disputes are resolved. And as I said earlier, ultimately, that legal agreement between you and the employer could end up with you the outcome of what you've got in your written agreement being ultimately enforceable in a court of law. So it's important that those written agreements are agreements that you have that keep you safe. And I'll just mention that the Association of Employment and Learning Providers has produced pro forma written agreements for agreements with employers, both levy employers and non-levy paying employers. They're not subcontracting written agreements, but certainly they will help you look at what you might need to do. But I would say that if you don't have your own internal procurement or contract specialist, legal specialist, then you really need to take the advice of someone externally who has that experience, and to make sure that your written legal agreement between you and your subcontractor and you and the employer keeps you safe, keeps the employer safe, and keeps your subcontractor safe. And at a minimum, your written agreements and legal contracts should require subcontractors to do the following. First of all, adhere to the funding rules, as I mentioned in the previous slide. Make provision for data and audit evidence that you can use as the main provider for your ILR returns on a monthly basis to the Education Skills Funding Agency. Give the Education Skills Funding Agency and nominated persons, because they sometimes use outside audit companies, access to all the documentation and the premises of you and your subcontractor relating to the apprenticeship delivery. So that could also be the employer. So the ESFA or a nominated organisation will need to be able to access their premises and access documentation, sometimes at quite short notice. You need to assess the performance of your subcontractors against the Ofsted Common Inspection Framework, and you should also incorporate their delivery and evidence into your self-assessment report for your Ofsted inspections. And you need to ensure the probity of the spend of the public funding. And let's be clear here, the levy is a tax, so it is public funding. It doesn't belong to the employer, it doesn't belong to the provider, it belongs to the government. So they will check you and monitor for financial irregularity. Now, quality assurance, providers and providers' employers are responsible, and I mean fully responsible, for all the actions of their delivery subcontractors and for the quality of their subcontracted delivery. And that's any apprenticeship training and on-programme assessment. So basically, if your subcontracting organisation, whether you're an employer or a main provider and you're subcontracting, is not keeping up quality of their delivery, it becomes your responsibility, and it's yourself that Ofsted will penalise when they inspect, not the subcontracting organisation. So it's incredibly important that you make sure you carry out your regular programme of quality assurance checks, and that they are substantial and you know exactly what your subcontractors are doing. And those quality assurance checks should be things like quality assurance visits at short notice to the subcontractor's premises if they're delivering there, or to the employer premises if they're delivering on the employer premises, face-to-face interviews with their staff, face-to-face interviews with their apprentices. You can also verify the apprentice's eligibility and existence. This is really important. You need to make sure that if your subcontractor is taking on an apprentice that they're going to deliver to with your subcontracted levy inside the employer, that you are very sure that that apprentice is eligible to receive that funding. So you must manage and monitor all of your delivery subcontractors to make sure all of that's taking place. And if any of your delivery subcontractors' circumstances change, i.e. they were to go into administration, key staff or directors are leaving, they're removed from the registration of apprenticeship training organisations for whatever reason the Skills Funding Agency deems necessary, you are responsible for making sure all those apprentices have other delivery arrangements in place to enable them to complete their apprenticeship. It becomes your responsibility at that point, not the delivery subcontractor, who, if they've gone into administration, may no longer exist anyway. So as I said, it's very important for you to understand that you carry the overall responsibility and therefore the overall risk associated with any subcontracting. So be very careful and make sure that you do carry out all those regular quality checks and your due diligence to keep yourself safe. So finally, on to endpoint assessment and subcontracting. Providers and employer providers have to ensure that the end assessment organisation, the EAO or the Apprenticeship Assessment Organisation, there's various acronyms for this at the moment. I think AAO, Apprenticeship Assessment Organisation, is becoming the most regular one, and EPA, Endpoint Assessment, is what an end assessment organisation does. They must be totally independent of any learning delivery that's taking place. So they must not have any involvement in the delivery of the apprenticeship. They have to be a totally separate and independent organisation and unbiased when they come in to assess the apprentice's knowledge, skills, behaviours and understanding and comprehension. If you're the main provider, you must contract with the Apprenticeship Assessment Organisation, and if you're the employer provider, you must also subcontract with the Apprenticeship Assessment Organisation. And you must have, again, a written legal agreement in place with the EAO that you're using that keeps you safe and keeps them safe and makes things clear, like how much the cost of end assessment, what it's covered, potentially when it's going to take place, who it's going to take place with, where it's going to take place and how. Are there partnership arrangements? Will the end assessment organisation use your premises or will they use their own? All of those aspects need to be taken into account in the written legal agreement. It needs to set out the arrangements for an assessment, including any retakes and payments. Now, this is an interesting one because in the funding rules, it does say that an end assessment organisation, if there's a retake, you as the employer provider or the provider may charge for a retake as long as extra learning has taken place as part of that apprenticeship. So if your apprentice has taken one endpoint assessment already and they've failed and they haven't passed their apprentice and they want their apprenticeship and they want to pass and you want them to pass, if you're the main provider, you can ask the employer to pay for that again as long as there's extra learning taking place as part of that apprenticeship. This is a difficult one because it means that at the beginning, when you're setting up your written agreement with your employer provider or your employer, you have to negotiate with them about what might happen should end assessment retakes need to occur. You could decide to take the hit yourself, but that could be costly depending on the cost of the end assessment. You could decide to split it both ways with the employer if the apprentice has not passed, or you could request the employer to pay for it all themselves if they are willing. If the apprentice has done no further new learning as part of their apprenticeship before they retake end assessment, then you have to pay fully. It can't come out of the levy. You have to ask the employer to pay for it, or the provider has to take the hit completely. There's no further funding from the Skills Funding Agency for that. So, providers must ensure that the price agreed with the employer for the apprenticeship delivery includes the amount the employer has agreed for the end assessment organisation for endpoint assessment. This includes the cost of external quality assurance, because end assessment organisations themselves will also be quality assessed externally to make sure that their end assessment is up to standard. So they have to pay for that. They're going to include that in the cost of their fees for the endpoint assessment so that they can pay their fees themselves. So make sure that everything is covered in your final price negotiated. The cost of endpoint assessment will vary, but the Skills Education and Skills Funding Agency does expect, and they put this in the funding rules, that it should not usually be more than 20% of the funding band maximum. So if you've got a 5,000 funding band maximum, the SFA basically just thinks that it should be no more than £1,000 of that £5,000 maximum. And that's regardless of what you may negotiate with the employer. So if the employer negotiates you down, and you've agreed with the employer to deliver 4,000 or even 3,000, that doesn't mean that the end assessment organisation has to come in and lower their costs. They will have to cover the cost of end assessment, so they may still decide to charge you the 20% of the maximum funding band, which means you as the provider may lose out. So when you're having those initial negotiations with your employer, be very careful to make sure that you are taking into consideration the costs of end assessment in your final negotiation with the employer and what they're going to pay. And to be honest with you, it's very sensible to ensure that your end assessment organisation is involved in those final negotiations so everybody knows where the costs lie, what are the iterations, and everybody's happy with that final written agreement, yourselves, the employer, and the end assessment organisation. So, what are the pitfalls of using subcontractors? Well, first of all, the pitfalls are that if you don't manage your subcontractors, and you don't develop delivery methods that are meeting the Skills Funding Agency's use of the levy and delivery of apprenticeships as policy intent, then sanctions may be imposed by the Skills Funding Agency. So if you're exceeding subcontracting thresholds, or employers are not reporting actual spend, as in actual spend of their levy on the delivery of apprenticeships, All of those requirements of the funding rules need to be met, and if you don't meet them, then you could have sanctions, and you could potentially be scrubbed from the subcontracting register, or even from the register of apprenticeship training organisations. So it's very important that you make sure all of those things are in place. Another of the pitfalls is accessing levy funding as a management fee income. This is whilst not actually delivering apprenticeships with the employer. So that point that I made earlier on, that we currently have large main providers who subcontract everything to a subcontractor but have no interaction with the employer and just top slice a large management fee, and we do know that they exist. I've heard of anything up to 40% management fees for some large employers who have nothing to do with the provider, for some large providers that have nothing to do with the employer and don't do any delivery, but they just manage the quality and the ILR arrangements. That is what the Skills Funding Agency wants to get rid of. They don't want to see that arrangement anymore. So that, as of 1st of May, that can no longer continue as far as delivery of apprenticeships is concerned. Obviously, you've got the potential for poor Ofsted outcomes if subcontractors are not monitored effectively and they're not meeting the Ofsted inspection requirements for delivery of teaching and training, and their performance data is poor. And also, for you as a prime provider, that information goes onto the Find a Provider and Apprenticeship Provider tool. So your performance data will go onto that tool, and future employers that may want to work with you will see it, which could put them off working with you in the future if your performance data is poor. Not including the endpoint assessment organisation in subcontracting negotiations, and finding out later on that actually the cost of endpoint assessment is going to cost you more than you anticipated, and therefore you're left short yourselves. And finally, not monitoring and auditing the financial position of subcontractors, either their register thresholds, but also their own finances to make sure that you're safe. And finally, out of that, your reputation. But there are also possibilities as well within subcontracting which are useful for you and your employers and employers in the surrounding area in which you may work as a provider. So using subcontractors develops delivery methods. Using subcontractors can expand and supplement your provision and delivery, potentially your curriculum offer. You could expand your curriculum offer by working with other specialist subcontractors, which could enable you to cover more employers in your area and expand your own apprenticeship delivery and provision. By developing more partnerships with specialists or providers with sector experience that you don't have in your organisation and teams. So that widens your offer across more employers in your region of delivery. And it means you develop mutually beneficial departments and partnerships between consortia of providers and employers, and that can help meet the skills needs of the local area and ensure the future skills of the workforce, which is in the end going to benefit yourselves, the employers, the economy, and all of us. And for employers, working with delivery experts in their field to supplement your own team's knowledge and skills, this can really add benefit to your workforce and to the skills of your workforce, and increase their skills and therefore obviously your success. You can access specialist knowledge and resources for areas your own staff may not be able to deliver, for example, English and Maths, off-the-job learning, e-learning facilities that your providers and your subcontracting organisations may have. You can also widen your apprenticeship offer across your teams to enable effective staff development and progression planning inside your organisation, which is always a good money-saving tactic. And also, again, develop those mutually beneficial partnerships which ensure the skills of your workforce in the future and ensure that in the area which you work, it's easier for you to find and recruit staff that you need because you're working towards having an effective workforce right across the region in which you're based. So those are the pitfalls and possibilities. And now Kate has a number 3 poll question for you.
So now, how prepared and informed do you feel about the potential for subcontracting? You're very prepared and informed and ready to go. You're mostly prepared but still need to do some reading, thinking and planning. You're not prepared but more informed and considering options. Not prepared, not informed and very confused. Or the last one, wouldn't touch subcontracting with a barge pole. You just go to...
Hopefully not the last one. I hope I haven't put people off with that.
Last couple of seconds. Okay, thanks.
Okay, so we've got 55% that feel mostly prepared, 9% who are very prepared, 32% prepared but more informed, But maybe I've managed to put 2% of you not prepared and not informed. So if you need any more help from me, please don't hesitate to contact me directly. And 2% if you wouldn't touch subcontracting with a barge pole, which obviously means I've managed to put some people off. I do apologise. Subcontracting really does have its possibilities, but there are onerous tasks, as you've seen today. So finally, one more slide, just to let you know, we are running employer-provider full-day workshops to prepare employer providers who haven't delivered before with everything that you need to know about becoming an employer provider. That's application to the register of apprenticeship providers, the levy, how it works, how to manage it, how to access it, how you can use it, the funding rules and regulations, the SFA audit processes and requirements, and the ILR data returns will be covering all of that. And basically our six-step guide to successful implementation of apprenticeship delivery for an employer provider. And those workshops are happening on Thursday the 13th of April in Wakefield, and if you we will send these slides around later, and those are links that you see at the bottom. You can click on them and they'll take you straight to our page. And then there's another one on Wednesday the 19th of April in London as well. So for any employer providers that feel you need more support, please do feel free to register for those workshops. Depending on how many people access them, we may run them later on in the year again as well. So, does anybody have any questions? I'm sure that you do.
We have a few questions that have come in during the talk. So, one question from Kirsty. If we have a levy-paying employer who wants to deliver to their own staff but are not on the register of apprenticeship training providers, can we be the prime provider and subcontract to them? So we essentially will be paying them their levy funding for delivery.
Yes, you can do that, but those thresholds apply that I mentioned earlier on. So as long as they are not delivering more than 100K's worth of apprenticeships inside their organisation with you or any other main provider, you can do that. You would still have to carry out all the due diligence requirements and obviously check the delivery of their apprenticeships, and you would have to deliver some of the apprenticeships inside that organisation yourself. You couldn't just give the employer the money and let them get on with it and top slice a management fee and leave them to it, as I mentioned earlier on in the presentation. So yes, you can do that, but again, the other thing that you would also have to do is make sure that that employer is providing you with evidence of everything they are spending the money on. So they have to evidence what they are spending their levy on. The Skills Funding Agency thinks that there's any use of levy that is not being spent on the delivery of apprenticeships, on programme materials and end assessment and on programme assessment, they will come in and remove that levy funding from you and from the employer.
Thank you. Next question is from Paul. The new standards state that Level 2 apprentices must complete Level 1 functional skills English and Maths and must then work towards and take an exam in Level 2 English and Maths, unlike now where they must only show they're working towards it. Do apprentices still need to complete a Level 2 exam even if they only complete their Level 1 towards the end of their apprenticeship? If not, what's the cut-off?
That's a very good question, and one that I've actually recently filed at the Skills Funding Agency, because I saw that in the funding rules as well, and I'll be frank with you here, I really do not understand what it's doing in there. This seems to me that what the Skills Funding Agency, Education and Skills Funding Agency are encouraging people to do is if your apprentice has, obviously if they're taking a Level 2 apprenticeship, they've got to complete the Level 1. So you get them through their Level 1, but they're only halfway through their apprenticeship, and you know you have to encourage them to go on to the Level 2. But you're very aware of that apprentice that you can put them on the Level 2, but they are unlikely to pass the test, but you have to put them through the test anyway. Is that not incredibly demoralising and demotivating for the individual apprentice that you've got to force them to sit a test that it's very unlikely they're going to pass? So I don't know, there's nothing in the funding rules at all that says anything about a cut-off. I've asked the Skills Funding Agency for further information about this, basically quoting exactly what I've said to you there. Once I've got some feedback from them about what this actually means, then we will definitely put it up on their website or we'll send out a funding bulletin. But at the moment, I'm really waiting for them to clarify what on earth this means, because it does seem to me that they are risking the reputation of you as providers, because you could have very high failure rates for Level 2 functional skills if you've got Level 2 apprentices that are unlikely to ever pass it. So it affects your achievement rates, it affects all sorts of things, but mostly it affects the learner, which for me is a very questionable rule and a very questionable tactic. So I'm sorry I can't answer your question directly, but we will try very hard to get an answer from the Education and Skills Funding Agency and post it round as a bulletin.
Thanks. This from Dan. Do you still have to declare subcontractors even if they are below the 100,000 limit?
Yes, you do. You have to declare any subcontractors you're working with, and you also have to send in the nil return even if you are not subcontracting.
From Gloria, will you be organising events for new main providers?
Oh, Gloria, that's not something we thought about, but yes, we potentially could do. The other thing to be aware of is if you're a totally new provider and you've not delivered before, at the FE Week Apprenticeship Conference last week, Keith Smith from the Education Skills Funding Agency did say they are going to be setting up a training program for completely new providers to the register. A training program which all new providers will have to go through. I'm presuming that they'll be sending out letters to everybody in the register that's new pretty soon, and that you will have to pass that training course or you will be dropped from the register. So it'll be very interesting to see what you think about that when it comes out. But if we think there are main providers out there that need more workshops similar to the ones we're running for employer providers, we can put some together, but I would need evidence that we'd have enough people to apply for it to make it worth our while and make it worth your while. Otherwise, if you are a totally new provider and you need some support, we are offering consultancy support, and we can come in on an individual, organisational one-to-one basis or with a group of your employees all in one room and provide a one-day workshop solely for you if that's needed, but we would obviously make a charge for that.
Suzanne has asked, you mentioned eligibility of the apprentice in order to receive funding. What does this actually mean and how is this covered?
It's covered in the funding rules documents that I mentioned early on in the presentation. Apprentice eligibility is mostly about not their age, because as from 1st of May, anybody from 16 upwards can take an apprenticeship, right up into people in their 60s. There are no age restrictions with the new apprenticeships, but what there definitely are is restrictions around nationality. So it's what nationality you are, whether you've got permanent residency, whether you've got right of abode, whether you've got right to work. It's all of those things, and there's a very long description inside those funding rules which lists which apprentices are eligible for levy funding and eligible for apprenticeships in this country. So you'll need to check things like passports and the stamps that they have in passports to say that they have a right of abode or they are a European citizen from various countries. Those are the main eligibility criteria.
Gwen has asked, how does the centre become an endpoint assessment?
You have to, if you are delivering apprenticeships, you cannot endpoint assess your own apprenticeships because you're not separate and unbiased and have had no contact with the actual delivery. But if you just want to become an endpoint assessment organisation, if you put becoming an endpoint assessment organisation into your Google browser or any other browser that you use, the .gov page will come up which says how to become an endpoint assessment organisation, and there's guidance on there, and the Education and Skills Funding Agency and Department for Education open up the application process to apply to become an endpoint assessment organisation fairly regularly at the moment, because as we know there are not enough end assessment organisations out there, and some of the standards don't actually have end assessment organisations attached yet. So one of the first things the Institute for Apprenticeships, which set off on the 2nd of April on Monday, has on its remit is to make sure that there are enough end assessment organisations and that organisations are supported to become AAOs. So search in your Google browser and that page should come up.
Kirsty has asked, you have referenced EPA organisations. Do these only apply to standards or do they also apply to apprentices starting frameworks?
No, frameworks don't need end assessment. Frameworks obviously stay as they are. You assess the apprenticeship as you go along. It's only the apprenticeship standards that need EPA.
Lovely. Michelle has asked that they're a main provider and they currently subcontract to members only. Can they still do this going forward, or will they fall foul of the open and transparent process under the guiding principles?
If you're a public organisation, you may fall foul of those principles, Michelle, so you definitely need to check those public sector regulations for open and competitive tendering. Take legal advice on that. Don't rely on me because I'm not a legal specialist when it comes to public procurement.
Rachel's asking if an established provider in Wales that has previously only subcontracted in England but wants to now become a full provider in England be classed as a new training provider and need to complete the course you just described. I think that was the SFA.
Yes, no, I don't think so because you're already supplying in Wales, but that's a very good question. I'm really not sure. The thing to do would obviously be to apply to go onto the Register of Apprenticeship Training Organisations, get through that application process. We do offer a passport, I can't call it that, I can't call it a passport checking process. We do offer an application checking process for registration. It's just a desk-based process that we can take people's applications through to check your application, make comments, and give hints and tips and advice on where to make improvements so that your application gets through. We offer an application process for that. All the organisations that we supported in the last round of applications got through and are now on the register. But apply to the register and then see if the Skills Funding Agency write to you to say you are a new provider and we want you to go for the course. I would doubt it, because part of the application process requires you to discuss your processes and procedures for delivery, and it would become very clear to them that you're already a deliverer. So I don't think so, but I can't guarantee it.
And the final question, oh sorry, a couple more just come in. One more question from Sharon, who said, could you explain what the substantial activity a main provider must carry out with subcontracted employers? My connection, her connection dropped out at that point.
Oh,
so maybe when she sees the recording.
Yes.
For that,
yes.
Rather as everyone else. So just because there's a couple more questions, so let me turn to that first. Sorry. Tanya's asked, if you are a prime provider,
yes,
but are yet to provide training, would you still need to go on the course with the SFA?
If you've gone on the register as a prime provider, but you've not delivered any training at all before, yes, you will have to go through that course with the Skills Funding Agency.
Okay. So do you have time quickly to say, Sharon, about the provider?
I knew someone was going to ask that substantial question. Sharon, I wish I had an answer for you. I have asked the Skills Funding Agency several times what they mean by substantial, and I cannot get an answer out of them. I think you have to use your judgment. As I said earlier, if, for example, you were a prime provider and you were delivering the business administration apprenticeships inside an employer, and you had another subcontractor that was delivering a specialist area of apprenticeships such as engineering, or maybe health and social care, or maybe the IT, because it's something you don't cover, and you were doing 30 apprenticeships and they were doing 30 apprenticeships, or you were doing 15 and they were doing 60, if you're covering your specialist area and they're covering their specialist area, I don't think the Skills Funding Agency would have an issue with that. What they're not going to want to see is 100 business admin apprenticeships taking place inside an employer and you're delivering one and your subcontractor is delivering 99. They wouldn't consider that to be substantial, in the same way as they wouldn't consider it to be substantial if you're just delivering the English and maths, potentially, or if you are maybe just delivering 1/10 of an apprenticeship and your subcontractor is delivering the rest of it. I think you do need to use your judgment here on what substantial may be. They obviously don't mean 50% anymore, but as I said earlier, what the Skills Funding Agency wants to avoid is that approach of main providers subcontracting the bulk of the levy they get from employers, but not actually doing very much themselves apart from taking a rather large management fee. The SFA will not allow that to happen going forward. So if you're taking a management fee, you've got to make sure that the management fee you're taking is worth the while, and that it's not basically a loss of public funds for what the Education and Skills Funding Agency would see as not a lot of comeback. The levy has got to be used for delivery of on-programme assessment, apprenticeships and end assessment. That's what they want to see it used for, not management fees.
So I'm conscious of time, so I think we will wrap that up now. I see there have been a couple more questions, and that will be answered in the...
Yes, I do go through all the questions that we get afterwards, because we get a report and I answer them. We put a questions and answer, a Q&A fact sheet up on the website afterwards, so that should go up in the next few days, because I'll answer those questions in the next 24 hours, and Kate will make sure it's put up on the site along with the actual webinar, recorded webinar, and the slides.
And there's been some lovely feedback. It's obviously helped people, so we really appreciate you joining us, and do look out for future events.
Thanks very much, everybody.